Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture looks at orca population structures. Now this is a bit of a fun lecture because what we're going to do is we're going to look specifically at killer whales and how their populations are organized. In this, we'll look at group structure and behaviors. We'll look at their ecological niche partitioning, and then we'll look at several examples that suggest there may be some evidence of sympatric speciation occurring right now. Now, what's interesting about this lecture is we're actually going to pull in a whole bunch of themes that we've covered all the way back to one of the earliest lectures and have moved forward since to one of the later lectures, and we're going to be pulling all these different themes to kind of look at these orca population structures. To start, let's actually define what a killer whale is. Orcinus orcas is the scientific name for a killer whale, sometimes more commonly and appropriately known as an orca. Orcinus orcas has a cosmopolitan distribution. That means that it is distributed globally or worldwide. As you can see here, anything that's blue is going to be an area where orcas have been documented. And of course, they may even be farther ranging than that, but this is just where they've been documented. Now, killer whales, of course, are notable for being what's called apex predators. In fact, sometimes they're even called the wolves of the sea because they are the very top of the food chain. They will eat anything from fish to pinnipeds to other whales, and there have even been events recorded where an orca has killed a great white shark. Of course, you may know orcas from your local marine park. They're commonly kept in captivity for places that will use them for some type of entertainment value. So of course, orcas are very familiar to the public in this eye as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and look at some of the different types of population structures. And probably the most notable population structure that has been studied is in the Northeast Pacific. The Northeast Pacific is going to be the set of populations that we actually see off the Washington coast, off Vancouver, British Columbia, that area in there. And we have two what are called ecotypes. So technically, are they two populations? Probably. The first one are called the residents. Now the residents are going to form larger groups, which are sometimes known as pods, and they predominantly consume fish such as salmon. They tend to stay very localized, which is why they get the name resident, or if they do move, they tend to follow fish migrations like salmon migrating. The other group are called transients. So we basically have residents and we have transients. The transients have a completely different diet. They feed almost exclusively on marine mammals, particularly other pinnipeds and occasionally whales, especially smaller whales. They also tend to have smaller, less stable groups, and of course they are more prone to roaming or migrating, so they'll move longer distances. They don't stay in one area, and that's why they get the name transients. So let's take a look at the social structure of the residents and the social structure of the transients. So starting with the social structure of the residents. The residents employ a unique and stable social structure that's called the matrilineal unit. In the matrilineal unit, you basically have the oldest female. The oldest female is going to keep all of her offspring, so this includes any sons and daughters. Now, if her daughters also have offspring, that's kept as well. If the son has offspring, they will go to a different matrilineal unit. So the matrilineal units are going to be stable. You'll never see an individual deviate for more than a couple hours from the group, and they are consistent. So as long as the oldest female is alive, that social structure is very stable. They tend to have a maximum of 12 individuals and up to 4 generations in any one unit. These units, of course, are going to have a very complex dialect, so they've got lots of vocalization, and of course, they're used to being together, staying together, and communicating together. When you get aggregations of multiple matrilineal units, these are actually called pods. Pods are going to be larger, but they tend to be a little bit more temporary in their aggregation. Now, what would compel one matrilineal unit to aggregate with another? Usually they have some genetic exchange between them. In other words, the son of one old female in one matrilineal unit has basically mated with a female in another one. And so there's some genetic cohesiveness that keeps them aggregated together. And so these are called pods. Now, what about the social structure of transients? The social structure of transients, which remember are going to be the killer whales that go out and hunt marine mammals, are going to be quite different. While they do also employ a very loose idea of the matrilineal unit, they tend to be much smaller and much less stable. Now, one of the reasons for this smaller group may actually have to do with how they forage. A study was conducted in 1995 that looked at the optimal foraging size of a group. And what they found was that if you had one individual, they didn't get very many calories per day, 2 was more than the sum of its parts, and 3 was even better. In other words, the optimal foraging size was actually 3 individuals, and any more than that reduced the number of calories that each individual would get. So this is probably a trade-off between how many orcas is it going to take down a pinniped or possibly a gray whale calf, and versus mouths to feed. So let me give you an example of this. If you just have one orca and that orca is trying to do something creative to go ahead and get a pinniped, they may not be very successful. But if you have 3 orcas, they may be able to successfully take down a pinniped. Now, would 10 orcas also be able to successfully take down a pinniped? Probably, but then you're trying to spread the nutrition value of that pinniped among 10 orcas, which means that there's fewer calories per orca, and so each orca gets less. So 3 seems to be the optimal foraging size, and of course also tends to be the most common group size for these transients as well. Now, interestingly enough, the residents and the transients do not show any evidence of interbreeding. In other words, they seem to largely ignore each other. So one thing that we might note from this is, or what we would expect, is that if they are not interbreeding, and therefore the gene flow between these 2 populations has stopped, then we would start to expect some divergence, some evolutionary divergence where you see some different traits show up. And that is indeed what we see. So in this picture here, you can see that the resident tends to have a more rounded dorsal fin, and the transients tend to have a sharper, spikier dorsal fin. Again, probably doesn't amount to much other than it provides strong evidence that these 2 orca populations largely ignore each other, and they do not interbreed. Now, interestingly enough, the pinnipeds, which should only fear the transients but not the resident, seem to also know the difference. If you get a group of resident orcas near a pinniped colony, the pinnipeds ignore them, and they don't seem to care that the orcas are there. As soon as the transients come in, the pinnipeds know it, and they of course employ evasive techniques so that they're not the next meal. So even the prey items can seem to tell the difference between the transients and the residents. So now that we've looked at the Northeast Pacific, let's move to the Antarctic. In the Antarctic, there's actually 3 distinct ecotypes, and they are called Type A, Type B, and Type C. Now, interestingly enough, these all differ with respect to coloration, with morphology, and one of the things that you might notice here on this picture, if you look carefully, is the eye patch shape. Notice how they are different between A, B, and C, size, and of course dietary specialization. So what are the 3 ecotypes? Well, Type A might be what you consider to be the more traditional orcas. These are going to be the largest. In fact, they are considered to be 50% larger than Type C. They have the traditional black and white coloration, and they prey on marine mammals that are not on ice, so such as small whales like minke whale or any other marine mammal that tends not to be in the ice area. Types B and C, on the other hand, both prey on prey items that are going to be within the pack ice. Type B, which employs more of a yellow coloration, not sure why that is, but it does, tends to prey on pinnipeds that are on pack ice, and type C are going to be fish eaters that are also found around the pack ice. In this picture here on the left, you can see a mother-calf pair. These are going to be type C orcas, and you can tell that by the shape of their eye patch. And of course, you can see them what's called spy hopping, where they kind of jump up and look around, get an aerial view of what's on land in an ice hole in the Ross Sea. So what are these Antarctic ecotypes doing? These Antarctic ecotypes are going to be niche partitioning. So remember that niche partitioning means that you're dividing up resources to reduce competition. In doing so, it allows these different populations to each be successful. So both the Antarctic ecotypes and the Pacific ecotypes employ ecological niche partitioning. Now, what's really been interesting about this is that there's some suggestion, in fact, a lot of suggestion that suggests that these may not be all one species anymore, that this is going to be evidence of what's called sympatric speciation. Recall that sympatric speciation can occur when two populations that have the potential to interbreed simply do not. In other words, they're located in the same region, they could be interbreeding, but they're not. Now, what would cause them to not interbreed? Well, it could be some type of anatomical difference that, for example, if you have a very, very small dog and a very large male dog trying to mate with a very small female dog, like a Mastiff mating with a Chihuahua, that's not going to happen. That's an anatomical block. So yes, they could live together, but they're not going to mate. It could be behavioral, where two populations simply choose not to mate, or it could be temporal, which means their mating cycles are out of sync in terms of time, or they breed in different seasons. All evidence suggests that these populations that are not interbreeding are going to be doing so because of behaviors. In other words, they simply choose not to interact with other members of the species, and therefore they have become more and more different. In the next several years, it's anticipated that some of these Orcas groups may actually be delineated as their own separate species. And that concludes our lecture on orcas, and I will see you next time.